who would be able to bring a kind of great renewal of America's place in the world. And it's really, I suppose, the challenge posed to America in terms of its place in the world, which does seem to us on our side of the Atlantic to be the key challenge facing Obama over the next 4 years. And I suppose if I were going to cast around for historical analogy, the obvious one would indeed be 1932-33, when Roosevelt comes into office. But I think there's also a trace, perhaps, of 1960-61 with the election of John F. Kennedy. But in a way, he brought, did bring a sense of, if you like, ideological renewal to America's place as the leader of the West, and of course symbolized very much by his visit to Berlin and a restatement of America's commitment to challenge what then seemed to be a particularly assertive, newly assertive Soviet Union at that point. But it's quite obvious, and here I entirely agree with Alan Brinkley, that the greatest challenge confronting Obama does arise from the position now confronting the global economy, not just, of course, the United States economy, and the role which the United States will play in helping to preserve the global economy from what I think is a very serious danger which does threaten it. And here we could go back to the 1930s. We remember, of course, that the Depression did not just lead to the fall of incomes in many parts of the world, particularly, of course, in the less developed world, in the agrarian world. It didn't just lead to long lines of people queuing for jobs or soup. It also led, of course, to the breakup of the world which had at that point been quite successfully, you might say, globalized, economically speaking. It led to the breakup of the world into a series, essentially, of rival economic blocs. And it doesn't, I think, take too much determinism to see that that helped to pave the way for the events at the end of the 1930s. Now, there are, I think, some sinister signs that confronted by the dramatic fall in the sort of market for particularly exports, that a number of major economies are going increasingly to look towards what might be described as protectionist measures or measures to defend their market share, and that this may well lead to some repetition of the kind of beggar-my-neighbour policies pursued in the 1930s, which led to a driving down in the overall volume of international trade and some of the political consequences which I suggested followed from that. And in that situation, the role played by the United States as the pivot of the global economy is going to be absolutely essential. Alan referred, of course, to the way in which Roosevelt behaved in 1933, when, if you like, he kicked aside the potential of playing a major role in the revivifying of the international economy in the crisis conditions of the early 1930s. And I suppose there is a real danger that in being preoccupied with the need to restore the American economy and to meet the wishes of those who have sent him to the White House, that Obama and his advisors may be tempted to perhaps be too inward-looking in the economic policies they pursue and not to recognize the extent to which the United States must balance its own interest, quite rightly, with the interest, you might say, of preserving a, broadly speaking, global free trading economy as well. Because if they don't, if that doesn't happen, I do think we are faced with, it's by no means clear at this stage, I may be overly alarmist, but we are faced with the possibility that rather rapidly, much more rapidly than now appears, we may be confronted by that, as it were, revival of the 1930s pattern of rival economic blocs. Now, if that were to take place, or even begin to take place, it would, I think, raise questions about the United States' relationship with its two greatest allies, which you might say together make up the United States' position as the leader of the West. It would threaten, perhaps, its relationships with Europe, and it would threaten, perhaps, its relationship with Japan. And in both these cases, I think, the United States needs to be extremely aware of the interests that both those two major allies have, which are not necessarily all that obvious from this side of the Atlantic. And people will no doubt be aware, of course, that in Europe there is a considerable preoccupation with the extent to which Europe's energy position brings it into a sometimes rather worrying state of dependence upon the supplies from Russia. And of course, here Europe is confronted by a power which shows some considerable signs of seeking to reassert its position in the world on the back of its control of massive energy supplies. And potentially also, it seems to me, that if the East Asian economy begins to move in the direction of protectionism, that the relationship between Japan and China might also change in ways which aren't necessarily compatible, you might say, with the interests of the United States as the leader of the West. Now, all those things seem to me to require a president to be acutely aware of the need, as I said, to balance the quite legitimate requirements of the United States for its own economic recovery with, as it were, a very great awareness of the geopolitical consequences that threaten the world and threaten the United States in particular if this economic recovery does not take place and if some element or the major elements of the global economy are not preserved something like the fashion they've emerged over the last 20 or 30 years. One last point, and then I must stop. This does seem to me to also raise a question, given the huge priority which is overwhelming geoeconomic and geopolitical issues raised, of just how much priority over the next 4 years the war on terror is really going to take. And it might be perhaps thought that perhaps that war on terror, which has loomed so large, or seemed to loom so large in American concerns, may perhaps take a slightly lesser place in America's order of priorities. If I could finish on a historical note, as you can imagine, if you are interested in the history of Britain and the British Empire, attempts to control Afghanistan by sending armies into it and seeking to administer it, the British have had quite a bit of experience of this. So far, it hasn't worked. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for including me this evening.